Hello and welcome. I am Steve Clements, editor-at-large of The Hill. Thanks for joining us for Conservation and U.S. National Security, a comprehensive discussion of the connection between international conservation efforts and our national security concerns. I'd like to thank our sponsor, the National Security Campaign, for their support of today's event. Our world is increasingly interconnected, highlighting the importance of not just preserving our natural resources at home, but also abroad. Zoonotic diseases, natural disasters, regional instability caused by food and water scarcity anywhere in the world could cause ripple effects and present national security problems for us here at home. Could many of our national security challenges be preempted with strong international nature conservation? What role is the U.S. currently playing in preserving our natural world, and additional efforts are needed? What are the balances and equities in these issues that we need to consider? We'll be asking these questions and more on the program today. Before we get underway, a few housekeeping notes. You can tweet us at The Hill Events with hashtag TheHillNatSec, The Hill NATSEC. We're broadcasting live. We'll be taking your questions throughout the program. As with any live stream, you could experience occasional trouble with the video. Refreshing the page should, in most cases, fix the problem. My first two guests today are two Republican congressmen with interests in foreign affairs and international conservation. Representative Adam Kinzinger is a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, where he serves as ranking member of the Subcommittee on Europe, Eurasia, Energy, and the Environment. He also served in the Air Force, and I have to say I was an Air Force brat. I lived on bases all over the world because my dad was like Congressman Kinzinger. He continues as a pilot in the Air National Guard. And Representative Jeff Fortenberry is a co-chair of the International Conservation Caucus. He's a member of the House Appropriations Committee, where he serves as ranking member on the House Agriculture Subcommittee, and as a member of the State and Foreign Affairs Operations Subcommittee. I should also mention that Jeff Fortenberry, whom I've had the pleasure of interviewing in the past, is one of Congress's leading nuclear experts. So as we talk about national security, as we talk about environmental issues, let me just start with Congressman Fortenberry for a moment. You know, we're perhaps trying to make a link here, and I know that both you and Congressman Kinzinger are dealing with what people might consider real national security concerns in the Air Force and nuclear issues. But I think today we have to ask the question is, are there fundamental parts of that equation that are missing, that are wrong? Do we need to recalibrate what national security means when it comes to environmental issues? Congressman Fortenberry?
Steve, first of all, thank you for inviting me to participate in the forum. I think the premise of your question there is very engaging. And now that we're in the 21st century, we're all struggling with, or we ought to be struggling with, what is the architecture for the international community as we move forward across disciplines that we tend to stovepipe, or that we tend to segment, whether that's economics or politics or national defense or the environment. And we think of ourselves in terms of an ecosystem where everything affects everyone. And I think this linkage is particularly profound and maybe not as well thought through between conservation, environmental well-being, stewardship, economic well-being, stability in place, and our own national security. I mean, the military will tell us very clearly, and Adam will confirm this, send us in last. Do everything that you can to create the conditions for stability, prosperity, mutuality, understanding, and trust, because when those things break, then we tend to send in the military. Real specific to your question that can be generalized to the principle, when I was a younger man, I used to serve on the Lincoln City Council in Nebraska. Now, my district is the beginning of the Great Plains, and so you think of us as big sky and tall grass prairie and beautiful fields, which we are, but we're also home to Arbor Day, the largest tree planting organization in the world. This deep value of stewardship for the land and our resources, and then a concept of healthy harvesting that land for community well-being is our ethos. This idea of creating a connectedness between community in place across the world and integration into the ecology of the land for healthy harvesting well-being, and a new construct around the way in which we think about the paradigm of economics. Since the Industrial Revolution, we basically have an economic construct in which we take and we make and we waste. The 21st century construct has got to be one in which we regenerate. So this deep value of stewardship for the land, connecting ourselves to a healthy prosperity as we utilize that land for our well-being and then regenerate it for the future, is intimately, inextricably intertwined into the idea of stability, which keeps people away from twisted forms of ideology and national and strange nationalism that I think can serve as as an architectural paradigm for 21st century thinking about how we all keep ourselves secure and prosperous.
I really appreciate that scaffolding. Congressman Kinzinger, one of the things, I'm a big fan of both of your Twitters, but, lately Adam's been out there, basically giving no nonsense commentary on a lot of fronts and not being afraid to speak your mind to whomever it may be. But I guess one of the questions I've had is when you think about conservation is fundamentally a conservative principle in many ways. And I'm just interested in why that's been so hard to create common ground around that notion between the parties about science, about conservation. How do you see what the opportunities are right now as we move into a new administration?
So I think there's a lot of bipartisanship on it. It doesn't make the news, when something gets done because it's not dramatic. But there is disagreement, and I think it's unfortunate on a lot of this stuff. Part of the reason is because everything is partisan nowadays, right? Everything. I mean, even wearing a mask is now partisan. And so I think that's part of an issue. The other thing is just, this oversaturation of information with people. So if somebody comes out and says things like, conservation is good, you're going to have a group that comes out and proves all kinds of studies that say it isn't. I'm just using that as a different example. But the bottom line is, when it comes to things like conservation and stewardship, as Jeff had mentioned, it also does something else. It teaches us to love and appreciate something, land, animals, what's around us, which I think in turn can help us to love and appreciate each other. We're in a new nexus, the 21st century kind of warfare. When we created the Space Force, people would make fun of it, saying it's like Space Trek or like Star Trek. But the reality is, Space Force is part of a 21st century kind of war and information construct. And I think the land and environment is as well, too. If you look at the discussion and the fights against terrorism, for instance, one of the big mistakes we've made in Syria was non-intervention early on. And so you have a whole generation of young people that are easy to be radicalized right now because they live in poverty and in misery. And the same kind of comes with land and conservation as well. If you look in Africa, particularly, I was in Kenya, and I went out with the Kenyan Wildlife Service. They're in combat literally almost every day to preserve their wildlife because Al-Shabaab and other terrorist groups are using ivory as a way to fund their operations. So all of this comes together in how we treat each other. And we also have to be careful with misinformation. It's a whole different subject, but I just think it's something we're facing right now of really epic importance.
Let me ask you both, Jeff and Adam, when you kind of look at what the needles are that can be moved, the low-hanging fruit from the Republican Party's perspective on this, what would be some of the initiatives that you'd either lead on or could get on board with? Jeff?
Well, one you just saw pass was a huge bipartisan initiative that was signed into law by President Trump, the Great American Outdoors Act, which basically fundamentally restores our national park system, which has had delayed maintenance and degradation for a very long time. The other thing that it did, and this part of it was overlooked, it made permanent what's called the Land and Water Conservation Fund. And what that does across America is a couple things. It sets aside pristine ecosystems for preservation, but it also promotes community recreation. Everybody wins. It touches this deeper value of a desire to set aside these unique, irreplaceable places that really ought to be cordoned off from what we think of as traditional development for the enjoyment of all. But it also creates a recreational benefit at the same time, which then has certain economic multipliers attached to it. So the whole idea that we have to think of environmental stewardship in terms of a pejorative perspective, that it's something negative. We regulate and control economies around the protection of the commons. I think we need to think differently about this as to how we using innovation and modern thinking that strong environmental outcomes, healthy harvesting, if you will, are again part of pursuing the right types of economic well-being. You do see this across Africa as well, where areas that were war-torn have been turned into parks, where communities that have had to subsist off the land are now able to leverage new types of economies by actually preserving wildlife and welcoming tourists and other types of production.
Right.
Some of the low-hanging fruit, again, we saw it with the Great American Outdoors Act, but I think if we can park ourselves in this type of space, one of the things that I'm doing is looking across our foreign assistance programs so that, again, the conservation dynamic becomes a part of the metrics in our foreign assistance programs as it affects our work in embassies, from commerce, the United States Agency for International Development, the Foreign Agricultural Service, the Wildlife and Fisheries Service, all of whom have components of things that touch this deeper value of an understanding of how to properly develop an economy that is preserved for future well-being. But we just sort of airlift programs into it. It's not a consistent across those governmental platforms. I'm going to pursue that, and one idea embedded in that is a conservation corps idea. Not so much a replacement of the Peace Corps, if you will, but persons who have expertise in America in agriculture, environmental science, veterinary science, community development, could enter into this core work for a smaller period of time and assist in America or across the world in unique conservation projects. We all remember this as a part of the 1930s, a way in which we put people to work on public works project. It's not a replication of that, but it's a modern updating of the idea that Americans of goodwill want to do something in this space, and we've got huge expertise to share around the world.
Right. Adam, I want to get a question in from the audience, but I want to sneak in just one little twist to what I asked you. I had opportunity to talk to John Bolton this week, and John Bolton and I have been wrestling partners for years in the sense that we've been entangled over some issues, but he made an interesting point in his book as well, which is when it comes to things like biosecurity, one of the reasons why he merged this Office of Biosecurity in the National Security Council, around COVID and pandemic concerns, into a biosecurity is in his mind to raise it and to integrate it on the level where, as we look at chemical weapons, as we look at nuclear weapons, we look at the bio question. I'm going to have Jane Goodall on later, and other environmental experts that are saying, part of, species destruction and extinction and, biodiversity is that this fear of zoonotic transfer of diseases, as we saw in COVID, is a real national security issue. And I heard John Bolton make that same case, whether people want to hear it from him or not. And so as you think about what the low-hanging fruit is, I'd love to get that national security twist on whether you think we've moved the right direction, we've moved the right boxes together, or whether we're still running at a deficit in dealing with, future things like COVID that may be coming down the pike.
Well, I think this is certainly a wake-up call. There were some good things in the CARES Act in terms of, studying this, in terms of pursuing, and people would call it sometimes that it was out of character of what should have been in the CARES Act, but pursuing things like veterinary medicine, which is extremely important, obviously, in this, as populations grow and move closer to animals and wildlife. That's going to be important. It's interesting in this whole process, if you think about the fact that we've spent, our national debt's going to be $10 trillion higher than it was going into this crisis, probably at least, not to mention longer term impacts to that. We had fights in this Congress over and over. We've shut down the government over like $500 million, which in comparison is nothing, because we always look at the bottom line and not at what we're trying to affect. That might be some of the problem with, having election cycles every 2 years. But I think we've started that. The problem is China, sadly, has kind of become a partisan issue. I hope that goes away at the turn of the year, because not just China, but those kinds of issues can't be Republican and Democrat. They have to be together. And I think, I'll just say quickly, in terms of low-hanging fruit in areas where we can pursue, I think national parks, one of the best things we can do as a country is to continue to show that example, that Teddy Roosevelt example, frankly, as Republicans, we ought to be quite proud of, which is the preservation of our national parks. And that's something that's beneficial, not just for our people, which is our most important focus, but also for examples around the world of how to do that and how to preserve this for the next generation.
That's great. Let's get a quick question in from Jamie Reeser, the President and CEO of Giving Voice to Resilience. Jamie?
In the United States, the term biosecurity is typically limited to bioterrorism and laboratory biosafety contexts. However, in other countries, such as Australia and New Zealand, the term biosecurity is addressed in a more comprehensive fashion to regard all non-native species that are harmful across a wide range of contexts. How could we evolve our law and policy frameworks in the United States to also take a more comprehensive approach to biosecurity, one that addresses zoonotic pathogens and other invasive species that impact the environment, the economy, and human health once introduced into natural systems. In short, what would a U.S. Biosecurity Act look like from your perspective?
Thanks, Jamie. Jeff Fortenberry, your thoughts on synthesizing these different elements of biosecurity?
Well, Jamie, thank you for the thoughtful question. Again, look, in Washington, there's a problem. If you have a good idea and money and the right intention, therefore you've affected policy outcomes. And I think we're living in a time in which a lot of approach to government is being rethought, and it is about this idea of the ecosystem, that you can't stovepipe and segment various disciplines and expect in the aggregate that sort of magically create an outcome. So I think consciousness is arising about exactly what you just said, broadening concepts in order to achieve outcomes. Adam mentioned this earlier. We very rarely do a lot of reflection on what does this mean, what is the outcome we're trying to achieve. We simply focus on how much money we're spending and how good our intention is. And that becomes the metric of well-being, and it's a false metric, unfortunately. More specifically to your point, and this doesn't address fully what you've talked about, but it partially does. We had another bill called Recovering America's Wildlife Act. Bipartisan, I believe we got over 100 members on it, hasn't passed into law yet. But again, the idea was fairly simple. And let's take the Endangered Species Act, for instance. Very important piece of legislation. But what ends up happening is it's 911. It's an emergency room procedure. So why not try to get upstream and think critically about what types of land that needs to be set aside, what types of land that needs to be in easement, what type of land can actually expand community recreational benefit and actually create a continuity of corridors for wildlife and species, so we don't get to where we are regulating and litigating, but that we are collaborating. Think of the hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions, that could be saved in preventing the expensive litigation that takes place over time, and the community benefit that could occur, again, from hiking, biking, hunting, other forms of agricultural harvesting that are consistent with wildlife preservation. That's not the fullness of an answer to what you're talking about, but again, it's back to the idea of trying to holistically approach something, and I think this is a values proposition for maturing government outcomes that we all need to embrace moving forward.
Thank you. And Adam, let me get a quick snapshot from you.
Yeah, so look, I don't know enough about what Australia and New Zealand does differently. It's something that we should look into a lot. I do think the point, and thank you for the question, is we do have to look at this differently. This has been a wake-up call. And I'll say, to Jeff's point, which I think comes into play here, if you look at the military, back in the 1990s, the idea of joint operations, like having a joint command, the Air Force, Navy, Marines, Army, all together in one command, was like unbelievably crazy. Nobody ever thought of that. And now it's seamlessly integrated to where if you want to be a senior officer, you have to do a joint command. I think it's going to be the same in the federal government, because right now you have DHS that can't talk to DOD, that can't talk to HHS. All this stuff is together, including issues of biosecurity. I mean, Jeff will tell you, anytime we try to get something done, you talk to the right people in one agency and you have to start over in another agency. And by the time you get to the right people there, the people in the other agency that you got to are already gone. And that's what's happening. So I think a joint command interagency in government and looking at these things more holistically is going to be really the move to the future.
Well, thank you. Well, Adam Kinzinger, Jeff Fortenberry, I want to thank both of you so much for joining us today, your candid thoughts, and we look forward to seeing in the next Congress what you folks cook up. So thanks for, and we're going to go to another Air Force veteran in just a moment, Chrissy Houlihan. So we'll talk Air Force stuff. But thank you both for joining us.
Thank you, Steve.
My next guest, as I just mentioned, is Congresswoman Chrissy Houlihan. She's also an Air Force veteran, a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee. She's been vocal on the issue of climate change, very vocal, and is a co-sponsor of the Big Cat Safety Act. This is not a Netflix ad. Representative Houlihan, it's great to see you again. Let me just start out. You've been very, I guess the word would be strident, flamboyant, out there on climate, and said we can't mess up. Tell us what you're thinking.
Sure, and I really appreciate being here. And in addition to being on the Armed Services Committee, on the Foreign Affairs Committee. I'm also on the Armed Services Committee. And these conversations about climate are national security conversations. And so if I need to be outspoken, it's only because it's our national security that's at risk if we are not. If I need to be asking people to think of ways that are actually actionable rather than just beautiful big ideas that are not, I'm guilty of that, definitely. Because when I was a young woman in the late, I guess, 80s, 87, I was a cadet in the being hopefully commissioned soon, shortly. And I was in training at Tyndall Air Force Base at that time. And even back then, in 1987, we were having brownouts and problems where we didn't have enough time during the day when it was cool enough for us to be able to train. And fast forward 30 something years later, and that's become not only a problem, but Tyndall Air Force Base has been obliterated from the map by a hurricane. And that has all kinds of consequences and implications for our readiness and national security, not just in the USA, but we're seeing that across the globe as well in many of our bases in the Arctic or in Asia. So this is a real issue that we should be taking very, very seriously. And I agree with Representative Kinzinger and Fortenberry that this is not a partisan issue. This is a safety and security issue.
Well, let me ask you a question on this. You know, with the Biden administration coming in and President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Kamala Harris, they both made very clear that the environment is a high agenda item, that rejoining the Paris Climate Accord, but it's also, you know, the WHO, it's the I mean, the integration of these issues is very real. So American presence matters. But if you step back and say, okay, what's really changed? Where does the rubber hit the road? Where do we really need to get traction? I'm interested in what you think is missing in the low-hanging fruit agenda. What do we really need to do to get back into a place where we're not just talking about joining treaties there, but we're able to kind of move this nation forward to both greater consciousness about the national security implications of environment, but actually doing things, which is going to include regulation, and it's going to include some costs and some winners and losers.
Right. And I think one of the things that I'm kind of most sad about, I'm a freshman here in Congress, and I'm an engineer by education and by background. And not only am I an engineer, I was formerly a chemistry teacher too. So one of the reasons why I wanted to be here in Congress at a federal level rather than in government at a state level was a concern about security and a concern about science. And I thought that I could be able to bring both of those skill sets specifically about biosecurity and specifically about pandemic. And I feel like that I arrived at the scene of the crime too late. We have been negligent over decades, arguably, maybe even longer, in terms of our responsibility to recognize biosecurity as a threat. And we have been delinquent in kind of down payments into that, not only domestically, but also internationally. And so we've kind of walked off the world stage in the last decades, not just within the last administration, and our responsibility to make sure that we aren't in this place that we are right now. So first and foremost, I believe we need to be restored to that place of authority and that place of responsibility as being one of the leading voices in the world on the importance and role of science, the importance of understanding that climate change is real and it's causing things like pandemic. It's causing things like migration of people because of that, and conflict because of that. And so if we're able to restore our place on the global stage and our responsibility in the global stage, that's a first step. But we also have to make sure that our budget reflects our values. And I think Adam Kinzinger mentioned this as well. Think about how expensive this last 9 months has been. The tragedy of loss of lives, but also the volume of dollars that we did not have to expend and the catastrophe that is our economy. Had we not abandoned things like pandemic response, had we been more thoughtful about zoonotics and its influence, we have the knowledge. We just chose not to prize that and value that in our budgeting process and in our infrastructure.
Representative Houlihan, I'm going to ask you an unfair question. It's admittedly totally unfair, so do with it what you will. You came in as a teacher of science. You have a lot of colleagues. Fortenberry and Adam Kinzinger seem to be very much with it in my book. But if you were to, in the aggregate, grade the literacy of your colleagues on these issues of science and of bio-awareness, if you will, or conservation awareness in this dimension, what grade would you give your colleagues?
That is probably a super unfair question. But what I will say is that the Congress, the body, needs more people who have that background, right? To complement the people who have other useful backgrounds as well. And the fact that we have only about less than 15 or so people with STEM or STEAM backgrounds in the Congress, in this body, is unfortunate, because we're being asked every day to think about issues of technology, cybersecurity, biosecurity, artificial intelligence. Literacy is a skill. Numeracy is a skill that more of us could use in the Congress and that we could use in the country. So I think that I would rather not give a grade, but I'm not sure that we're all passing. How about that?
Would you give a grade to the Trump White House?
I believe that we have been enormously disturbed by this administration and this White House. I believe that we have lost tens of thousands of lives because of that irresponsibility when we talk about COVID, but also if you just talk just in general about our responsibility as a leading nation in the issue of climate as well. We can't afford to lose time, and we've lost time.
I have a question for you from our audience. Philip Selleck, who is the Park Projects Director of the National Park Trust. Philip?
Though conservation is so very important to our survival, it is not commonly understood to be. It should be integral to what we do every day. What strategies do you envision are necessary to give the public an understanding of cause and effect and to integrate the practice of conservation into daily life, as well as promoting bipartisan support in the political arena? Thank you.
What a great question, Philip.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's such a huge question, really, because it's got so many dimensions to its answer. And one thing that I would want to focus on is I actually did I helped as a consultant for the Philadelphia Zoo a while ago, and I was focusing for them on education and what the modern zoos of our world should be doing to help people understand the importance of conservation, the importance of diversity, biodiversity, and zoos, have a bad rap in some cases, but they are one of the last places that allow regular people to understand our role in the world and what we can do to be responsible to it. And so what I would say is the first thing is an education. People need to understand empathy for things that are not them. And I'm not even just talking about animals, flora and fauna. I'm talking about people too. We have a real empathy problem. And that's one thing to the question that you had about, bipartisanship. We have a responsibility as leaders and representatives of our communities to make sure that we're talking about civility and decency amongst people, but also civility and decency towards things on our planet that are not humans. And that's a really important thing. The other thing when we talk about empathy is if you bring it back to home, right? If you bring it back to your home and hearth, we can talk about the impact that things like conservation and things like preserving our environment have on families, particularly on women and children. And those are the hearts of our homes. And if we know that we have a poor environment that people are living in, whether it's because they don't have access to food or water, or whether it's because they are being chased out of their communities due to environmental changes, we know that we will be less safe. And this is a conversation that resonates with people. Right. It resonates with people when we think about the individual people in their lives, and then we think about the implications to the community and to the planet.
Well, Representative Chrissy Houlihan of Pennsylvania, thank you so much for your work. We didn't get to talk about the Big Cat Safety Act, but in a way you were obliquely referring, I think, to part of that and how we think about wildlife at home and abroad. So I hope you'll come back and talk about that as well. Really respect the work you're doing in science broadly, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
And now it's time for the sponsor perspective portion of the program and a message from the sponsors of today's event, the National Security Campaign.
Thank you for joining today's event with The Hill, brought to you by the National Security Campaign on the role of conservation in national security. National security professionals are coming to grips with the ramifications of what some ecologists call an ongoing biological annihilation. Today, the CEOs of 4 of the world's leading conservation organizations will share with us the work being done when it comes to conservation efforts abroad, how that affects U.S. national security, and why U.S. investment in these areas is so crucial. First up is Jennifer Morris, CEO of the Nature Conservancy. She'll highlight the importance of biodiversity and the transformative role that global communities play in creating sustainable economies driven by conservation. Jennifer?
So nature, as we all know, is the underpinning of our societies, our health, and our economies. We're reminded of this every day as we increasingly understand the links between the destruction of nature and the spread of zoonotic diseases like COVID-19. But nature is in serious trouble. Last year, a major UN report found that nature is declining globally at its fastest rate in human history. Reversing this alarming trend is about so much more than conserving nature. It's about improving our own health, boosting our economies, and reducing the impacts of natural disasters. In short, protecting our natural security means protecting our national security. In northern Kenya, for example, the Northern Rangelands Trust, which has received vital support from the US government, brings together 39 community conservancies to help them sustainably manage their lands, build sustainable economies linked to conservation, and drive peace efforts to mend years of conflict. Sadly, the global pandemic is putting models like this, which depend heavily on tourism revenue, at risk. But we need to focus on better diversifying income sources to help empower communities in stewarding their natural resources. This will take a concerted effort by national governments, both here in the United States and abroad, to invest in proven international conservation programs. We know that this is the right thing to do for both nature and for our national and economic security.
Thank you, Jennifer, for those important perspectives. Next up is Carter Roberts, President and CEO of World Wildlife Fund. Carter, from your perspective, why is conservation important not only to America's approach to global development, but also to its national security interests?
Much of the world is concerned about climate change, and rightly so. I am also worried about running out of planet. When you see the predictions that we're going to reach 11.5 billion people globally by the end of this century, and that much of the world wants higher standards of living, all of that places increased pressures on the natural world for food, for infrastructure, for building homes for our children, and for building the economies and the businesses that we need. We see around us what happens when we break our relationship with nature. With forest fragmentation and the illegal trade in wildlife, we make it more and more possible for pandemics and zoonotic diseases to arise and to disrupt our societies as COVID-19 is disrupting ours today. When we destroy mangroves or destroy forests in mountainous areas, we also see what happens with extreme weather events. Those communities without those natural resources suffer much, much more than those who still enjoy the protection of nature in those settings. And we also know what happens when extreme weather events, drought, and the inability of families to feed their children. When that happens, people move, governments often experience conflict over those same natural resources, and that ends up destabilizing the world. It is in our own national interest, from the point of view of security and stability, for us to continue to lead the world in both guiding and financing conservation of biodiversity and helping other countries safeguard their resources, all of which depends on our ability to build partnerships with civil society, with communities, with other governments around the world to safeguard nature and to build security and stability where we need it most.
Thanks, Carter, for those valuable insights. Sanjayan is the CEO of Conservation International. He'll discuss the dependence on natural systems for economic livelihoods. Sanjayan, the floor is yours.
Our organization, Conservation International, is based on a simple premise, that people need nature to thrive. And if you ever needed a reminder of why that is true, I mean, 2020 has tragically and in spades shown our complete interdependence with nature. When nature is unhealthy, it is human populations that feel it the most. The air we breathe, the water we drink, the food we eat, our economies, our jobs, our spiritual and emotional well-being are all intimately tied to nature. Scientific studies have shown that this pandemic, like virtually all other pandemics, really has emerged from nature, and the destruction of nature and the rapidity with which we can invade nature has really allowed pandemics to emerge and spread in human populations with devastating impacts on lives and on economies. Now, what can we do about it? Well, a couple things. One is we could spend money very thoughtfully in three areas. One is avoiding or reducing deforestation, particularly tropical deforestation, on ending or managing better the massive commercial illegal wildlife trade that happens globally around the world, and monitoring new emerging diseases from the wild. You do just those three things, and a new scientific study published in really the most prestigious journal by scientists, including scientists from Conservation International, have shown that we can reduce the chance of the next pandemic by 30%. What is it going to cost? It's going to cost a lot less than what this pandemic has cost our economies. The pandemic has cost somewhere between $5 and $6 trillion and counting. For 50 times less than that, we can reduce the chance of the next pandemic by 30%. To me, that is great return on investment. We can also work better and more closely with indigenous communities and local peoples, the best stewards and protectors of wild nature. Working with indigenous communities, strengthening policies to protect their lands will help us avoid the next one.
Thank you, Sanjayan. Next, we'll hear from Christian Semper, President and CEO of the Wildlife Conservation Society. He'll share his thoughts on the cataclysmic ecological and climate crises that threaten to worsen poverty and suffering on a global scale.
The COVID-19 pandemic is an unprecedented global health crisis with severe economic and social impacts. But we cannot look at the pandemic separately from the global biodiversity and climate change crisis that threaten to exacerbate poverty and suffering on a global scale. Zoonotic diseases like COVID-19 are caused by viruses or other pathogens that spill over from wildlife to humans. Ecological degradation increases the overall risk of zoonotic disease outbreaks originating from wildlife. At the same time, we see deforestation and ecological degradation driving humans and wildlife closer together and increasing the likelihood of virus spillover and spread. A global climate crisis continues to loom and will only worsen without our attention. Extreme weather-driven disasters are increasing in number and severity on a global scale and are a growing threat to developed and developing countries alike. But they pose a particular challenge for the latter, where they amplify existing stresses and vulnerabilities. Dealing with these types of disasters during a pandemic adds another level of complexity. Will the necessary resources be available to tackle these three crises and also to recover from them? Will relief agencies that are stretched to their breaking point be able to answer the call as they normally do? If the answer is no, threats become very real. In response, we must work together with indigenous peoples and local communities to conserve nature. If we are to survive the three crises represented by climate change, zoonotic diseases, and biodiversity loss, we must effectively protect and conserve at least 30% of our planet. We must stop all unsustainable and illegal exploitation of wildlife, and we must work to prevent another COVID-19-like pandemic by ending the unceasing assault on nature. Together, we can make this happen.
Thank you, Christian, for those outstanding remarks. Now, putting it all together, the compelling messages from the four CEOs we just heard from underscore the importance of international conservation to security. The ties between conservation abroad and U.S. national security interests are not only clear, they're strong. So thank you to everyone tuning in. And now back over to Steve Clemens and The Hill.
Rod, thank you very much. I really love those comments. I want to say that one of my team said, oh, I think you said national security instead of natural security. And I'm sort of saying, well, maybe that's the point today, that maybe we need to make them interchangeable. And so I want to really thank, and it was Jennifer Morris who said preserving our natural security means preserving our national security. I find it very important metaphor for today, if you will. So thanks to the Nature Conservancy, the World Wildlife Fund, the Conservation International, Wildlife Conservation Society, and the Betty and Gordon Moore Foundation that are behind the Natural Security Campaign. And now it's time for our panel of experts. Sally Jewell, great Sally Jewell, served as Secretary of the Interior under the Obama administration. She now sits on the Nature Conservancy's global board. Full disclosure, the Nature Conservancy, of course, is part of the National Security Campaign, and I love them. So they're helping to sponsor today. Eileen O'Connor, an old friend, is Senior Vice President of Communications Policy and Advocacy at the Rockefeller Foundation. Previously, she served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for South and Central Asia. And let me just tell you about Eileen. She's been in some very tough neighborhoods where national security and natural security have overlapped. Look forward to getting that. And finally, Christina Mittermeier is a marine biologist, activist, and conservation photographer. In 2018, she was named one of National Geographic's Adventurers of the Year. She's also the co-founder of the nonprofit Sea Legacy and Only One. Welcome, all of you. It's great to see you again, Secretary Jewell. I also mentioned that Secretary Jewell was the CEO for many years of my favorite company, REI. So that said, as we're talking about this, Sally, for a moment, and looking at these overlapping lines, right? The message today is, does natural security, does environmental security require an upgrade in how we assess and think about it, which means a different discipline. And that part of that is economic as well. Part of that is investment and regulatory. So as you look at those lines that need to cross, so that this isn't a kumbaya forum, this is a serious forum about upgrading these questions, what are some of the elements of that we need to change? And then I'll go to all the panel on this.
Well, it's really, really important that we recognize the value of our natural system. And if you look over the course of our nation's history, we don't. We think of our natural resources as something to be exploited. We think about timber as something to be cut without thinking about the value of the carbon or the importance of forests and clean water. We use water as though it's free, when in fact, water is going to become such a precious resource. We need to be paying more for that than we are, for example. And one of the interesting things that we did during the time that I was at REI is say, our business depends on a healthy environment through outdoor recreation and tourism, which drives jobs to local, rural economies and so on. But we aren't making that case. The only people making the case within the US government and governments around the world are those who want to exploit resources. So let's start talking about the value of the natural systems and how they can create sustainable rural economies so that we can align the interests of the natural world with the economic interests of our nation and nations around the world. And so many examples of that, but I will pause there and just say that
it's a great door opener. It's a really great door opener. And ask Eileen. Eileen, we've known each other. I first think we met in Kabul. But I think that when you're now at the Rockefeller Foundation, that is literally putting billions of dollars behind various forms of what I would call the social contract in America, inclusiveness in America, economic development and participation in America. All of these actually contribute to how we treat not only each other, we were talking about empathy before, but also the natural environment. And I guess, my question to you is no foundation has so many resources you can do it all. What are the strategic bets that you're making to get the echo effects of the system, to get the mutually reinforcing positive cycles that you need to get so that we get change in this topic? And when we come back in a couple of years, we can say, hey, we've really accomplished something.
Well, I totally agree with Sally that we have disconnected the conservation and attention to the natural world to our economic interests. So if you look in the United States, oftentimes people have portrayed economic or conservation policies with taking jobs away. And that's also the way you've seen the construct around climate change, where we at the Rockefeller Foundation look at the fact that we can use renewable distributed electrification around the world right now, solar panel mini grids, to pull 2.5 billion people into the global economy. What does that mean for the United States and for our economy? What it means is that we're going to create more markets, more availability for those markets to have U.S. products and other technological advances from the United States, and that means more jobs. We have to change this narrative from something that this is just good to do to protect the environment to something that it's a great investment. And I mean, I can tell you too, in terms of natural security means national security. I mean, you and I have both seen in Kabul or in Pakistan, when the heat is up in Pakistan and there is a lack of electricity for cooling inside, it leads to riots. We've seen it over and over again. The summer is riots in Pakistan, and it's often caused by massive amounts of heat. We've also seen that the lack of economic opportunity throughout the world has driven extremism and the attraction to extremist ideologies and extremist narratives. People who feel left out will go to a community that is being created mostly by false narratives. So we need to be able to contribute. And that's why we're spending $1 billion over the next 3 years to pull together other multinational funders and to hopefully convert that to $1 trillion in investment in a green global recovery. So investing in economic recovery can also be an investment in the natural world. And we need to make sure that our mantra about, investing in infrastructure, that we have a principle of do no harm. So, and I think that's a really key for us. And also recreating this narrative that the natural world is not just about national security, it's about economic security.
I really appreciate that story, and I want to jump to Christina, but I also want to say it's not just the global underinvestment in these issues. When you look at the fires in California and New Mexico and Colorado, when you look at how we've seeded the political dynamic of people get support if they're on the right side of the political line. I mean, I'm on the editorial side of our operation. I can say those things, but it raises fundamental questions about the social contract in this country, about how we think about this. And I just want to put that on the table because I was very taken with what you said, Eileen. Christina, you have, I want to just put one little element out there. I bought this photo. It was for a dinner for the Committee to Protect Journalists, which was the first photo that had been published by a female photographer who had been kind of hiding out under a man's name at National Geographic, of 3 incredible personalities of Japanese women with cherry blossoms that they had, and it was taken like 1918, and it was one of the first color invaded prints, and I was very proud of it because it said a lot of things. One, women photographer, nature, natural appreciation, personalities, and sort of, and it gave face, at least at that time, to something. And I'm just interested as you think about this, because part of what you're doing, you're trying to give a face and a track into these topics to those. What do you think we need to know for those viewers out there that you're trying to inspire to take this agenda more seriously? How do you see it?
Thank you for the opportunity to comment on this. And first, I want to say that I so completely agree with what Sally and Eileen are saying, because I've seen it firsthand in my travels, both as a conservationist and as a photographer. And in publications that I've contributed to, we have found that when there's biodiversity loss, there's an 80% correlation with conflict and violence. So very much, conserving biodiversity and making sure that communities have the resources they need to survive is very much something that leads to peace and prosperity. When it comes to my work, I started out as a scientist, and I realized that not enough people speak the scientific language that we need to understand the planet that we live in. So I became a photographer just because I wanted a bigger microphone with which to share these ideas. And as I've gone on to do this work, I've come on to the realization that one of the places where we need bigger investment is in the communication of these issues. I think people are not aware completely of just how much danger we're in and what it means to lose biodiversity. People don't understand that the melting of the Arctic has a direct implication on our lives and our economies. And to Sally's earlier point, which is so important and so poignant, the divorce between economy and ecology is something that is very real, and we're living the consequences right now. So it's not just that we need to incorporate, the value of natural resources into our thinking. We need to incorporate it into the economy and, the value that these ecosystem services lend to humanity every day. So my work as a communicator and as a photographer is just to bring a larger audience into this conversation, because at the end of the day, what we really need is we need political will, and we need much more investment and resources into these issues.
Thank you for that. Let me ask you, all of you, just a question. I mean, and Sally, I don't know if the time that I've been sitting in this chair today, the Biden administration has announced its Secretary of the Interior. So maybe that's already been announced. I don't know. Maybe it'll be Deb Haaland. Maybe it'll be someone else. But when you look at someone coming into this job, what do they have to get right? Many people don't know what an Interior Secretary does. They don't know what power he or she has. They don't know what needles can be moved. We've both been talking about the importance of getting more concern in, getting this wedged into the economy, as just Christina said. But as you look at that, what can that department do, would you advise, as we move into a new presidential administration?
Well, it's a large and complicated department, but to try and synthesize it, it is about listening. There's everything that happens in the Department of the Interior involves conflict, whether that's someone wanting to graze on public lands and someone wanting to preserve lands, or whether it's someone wanting to develop and someone wanting to conserve. And the key is listening to all of those points of view and finding the intersection of interests of that Venn diagram. And there are intersections of interest. For example, we worked across Wyoming and Colorado and other areas to protect the sagebrush sea, which is important to 350 different species, focused on one little bird, the greater sage-grouse, to try and prevent a listing under the Endangered Species Act through conservation. That brings certainty to business, and it brings certainty to the environment. And even though some of those actions were reversed by a subsequent administration, the fact is, if you're a developer of resources, you're going to go to the areas that are deconflicted. So the key is getting everybody to the table, listening, and coming up with that common ground in order to move forward. And we found that over and over and over again, that businesses want to play, local governments, tribes, citizens, activists will play if you listen to them and you find that common ground.
I appreciate it. Christina and Eileen, recently I talked to former Energy Secretary Ernie Moniz, and he, I think the name of his organization now is the Energy Futures Initiative, and he suggested this idea of an energy jobs coalition. He said, no matter what we think is going on in the economy right now, millions of people have been left behind, communities of color have been badly impacted, the economic situation of people has been unwound terribly. Why not look at this as a time like we did in the 1930s and find a way to connect people to the greening of the economy, to try to move, large infrastructure projects and people? I'd just be interested in your own insights into thinking about the smartness or the difficulty of that in terms of connecting American citizens, in this case, to this broader topic of, jobs, economic benefit, but also greening the economy and looking at natural security in a very different way. Christina?
Absolutely. I was listening to Jeremy Rifkin, the economist, last night talk about the third industrial revolution and the advances that we have made in science, in renewable energy, and in communications, and how that is, the fundamentals for building this new green economy that's going to bring millions of great new jobs for young people and for an existing workforce that is in need of work and jobs. And Eileen is a bigger expert than I am at this, but I just want to make the point that for communities in Africa, in South America, in Asia, this is an incredible opportunity to leapfrog a dying infrastructure that's based on fossil fuels and jump directly into a new green economy that doesn't leave people or planet behind. Eileen, I would love to know what you think.
No, I absolutely agree. And that's been part of the problem is that, the old grid technology wasn't reaching these 2.5 billion. But instead of just extending the grid, we should be thinking in all new ways of doing it. And we can. We've brought down the cost of renewable energy from like 80 cents a kilowatt hour to 20 cents. And we are focused on bringing that down even more. That's one of our objectives. We believe renewable energy will actually be less expensive than fossil fuel technology in the very, very near future. I would also say that, you know, when we ignore the economic benefits in terms of jobs and projects, et cetera, in the United States, and when we refuse to accept the science on climate change and the need to go to renewable energy, we are actually ceding the ground to other countries. China is now far ahead of us on battery technology. And so those are jobs. That really is jobs. And so when we look at a global recovery and a US recovery, we're really pushing internally as well to do more with communities that have been left out, maybe from a reduction of the use of fossil fuels, but how do we move them to jobs in a green economy and the use of green technologies? Because unless we do this, it's not just about the climate, you know, the emissions, it's also about the effects of climate change on temperature, on sea rising, et cetera, that we're already seeing the effects of that with the wildfires, you know, basically destroying farmland, with the floods destroying communities in Florida that still have not been rebuilt. I mean, the things of, you know, hurricanes, et cetera. So these are the things that are leading to that instability, and that we somehow are not connecting to the economic destruction that causes. So for some reason, we keep thinking that investing in green technology is somehow a giveaway, when in fact it's a risk mitigation factor, and it's actually I would call it a profit center. And I think businesses, by the way, are coming to that realization, because more and more businesses we're seeing moving and wanting to partner with us on our $1 billion big bet in distributed renewable electricity in Africa and India, and we hope to take it as well to Latin America.
And I really appreciate the three of you and your candor in this. And I've often thought, as we think about, you know, global environmental policy, you know, what's going to be the Sputnik moment that's going to animate the kind of partnerships and resolve to move forward. And I think we got into some of that here today. I think there's a lot more discussion that needs to happen. So I want to thank Secretary Sally Jewell, former Secretary of the Interior, Nature Conservancy Board, former CEO of REI. Need to put that in plug in. Eileen O'Connor, Senior Vice President for Policy and Advocacy at the Rockefeller Foundation. And we'll have to get into those Kabul experiences sometime. And Christina Mittermeier, co-founder of Sea Legacy and Only One, great photographer. Thanks so much for your candor and for the things you're doing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Philippe Cousteau is the grandchild of explorer Jacques Cousteau. He's an Emmy-nominated TV host and author who just launched the first installment of his new book series, The Endangereds. It's a great title. He also serves on the National Council of the World Wildlife Fund, where he's a partner in their natural security campaign, the sponsor of today's event. Philippe, great to see you. I don't know if you remember, but I remember well hanging out with you in Lisbon at the Web Summit. So let me just start out when you were Web Summit, because that's one of the last times I traveled. I feel like like a long time ago. But for those of you, for those of you who don't know the Web Summit in Lisbon is attended by 70,000, mostly young. There are some old folks like me, but folks that I would call the kind of next generation digerati. And I was so impressed with how you, in a way, became a rock star in this group by connecting their aspirations, what they were trying to do. So I'd love you to kind of talk about how you communicate. How do you connect with generations of people, that to get them to understand the priority of what we're talking about today?
Well, Steve, it's a great point. And I think that the good news is that we find young people today are much more connected to the world around them, are much more engaged in these issues. When I was growing up, when we were growing up, our friends were people in our communities, people in our school. Now we have young people through the work I do at Earth Echo, my nonprofit. We have young people that have friends all over the world through social media and through digital media. And so it's a much more connected world. And that's the good news, because I think one of the challenges we've had, and some of the previous speakers have pointed this out, is that we've done a poor job in the environmental community of connecting the dots around how these issues affect us. Still today, we have polar bears as the poster child of climate change, when I think we should be having people as the poster and children as the poster children of climate change, because these issues are affecting our health and our security, as we're talking about today. And so connecting the dots, young people understand that. They understand that when we talk about the environment and conservation, We're really talking about their health, their economic prospects, and security around the world.
Well, to that end, I should mention that you just tweeted out a picture of your 17-month-old daughter and said, this is why we're doing what we should do. It was very moving. I actually loved that tweet. Let me just ask you, with Earth Echo, when you kind of look around, you travel all around the world, do you think, how do I ask this in the right way? Do you think Americans get it? Do you feel that they're feeling that they are pressure sensitive to the changes right now? I know you see it internationally. I'm just wondering what you see in this country.
Well, there's a lot of good news there too, Stephen. And to mention that tweet, that photo that I posted of my little daughter, Vivienne, who's 18 months now. I'm 40 years old this year. 40 years ago, when I was her age, the world was a much richer place from the perspective of biodiversity. We've lost half the amount of biodiversity on this planet in 40 years in my lifetime. And I look at her and I think every day, what kind of a world, how dare we pass that kind of a diminished world on to her? And yet today, I know that some of the members of Congress earlier were talking a little bit about the partisan nature, the unfortunate partisan nature of environmental conversations today. And yet, if you go back, you don't even have to go back to Teddy Roosevelt. You can go back to Richard Nixon, who founded the EPA, NOAA, created the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act extension, the Marine Mammal Protection Act. This has historically been a bipartisan issue in this country, and we can get back to that. In fact, a recent study by Pew Charitable Trust found that young Republicans, more than half of young Republicans, believe the U.S. government is not doing enough to combat climate change, and that's a 2-to-1 increase over baby boomers, Republicans who believe much less in climate change and the issue. So what we're seeing is a trend going in the right direction. We're seeing young people that are beginning to embrace this issue. And we're also seeing in the recent election a major motivating factor for Biden's win and for the historic increase in the youth vote in support of his campaign was climate change. That was a major motivating factor for this recent election. And so I think everybody, bipartisan across the board, needs to get on board. And what you're finding is younger Republicans care about these issues. So that's the good news in this country as well.
Tell us about your book, The Endangereds.
Well, The Endangered, it's a brand new book with HarperCollins. We just came out about a month ago. It's a middle grade reader book targeted to 8 to 12-year-olds, and it's a fiction story because, again, connecting the dots, serious documentaries, reports, op-eds, all that stuff's really important, but we also need to be able to tell stories that engage a younger generation, and fiction is a great way to do that. It's a story of a motley crew of endangered species that come together, and like an A-team for nature, they travel the world because they've achieved hyper-intelligence, this special secret serum, and they thwart conspiracies against nature all over. So it's gotten great reviews. It's a lot of fun, and it's just another way to engage young people in these kinds of conversations. And that's I think critical if we're going to build the cultural and social foundation in society in order to support the political will that we need in order to make progress, bipartisan progress on these issues.
Philippe, I want to ask you a question, and I'm not sure I'm going to get it right, but I want to try to put it out there, which is, oftentimes if I'm doing a global affairs national security forum, we're discussing national security and national security today, I'm often torn between some bank shot that's out there on achieving security, some way to, change the way that people think or whatever, versus incremental earnestness, the straight line, let's move a little bit forward. And there's a tension between these two, between strategic leaps and others. And a lot of people have said you're not going to get the kinds of impacts on natural security until you begin to get economic pricing into this, unless you have a way to price carbon, unless you have a way to price old forests, unless you have a way to have to, price the value of the oceans, that the way the economic equations are stacked is that they're stacked against the polar bear and they're stacked against kids because it's hard to find the dollar value of what you're losing. So I know that's very wonky, but I know you've thought about through some of these issues. When your grandfather was doing this stuff, there was an incredible mystique in terms of what he was showing and opening for the first time. Now the question is, are there dollars that can be applied to these things so that gravity can help us get to some better outcomes easier than we otherwise would? Does that make sense?
Well, I think it does, Stephen. And I think there's two factors at play here. One of the factors is that it is difficult to begin to look at, how do we price externalities, essentially, is what we're talking about. How do we price the externalities, the true costs of the destruction of fossil fuels, of, unsustainable agriculture, et cetera, into the price of those goods and services and start to level the playing field. It's $1 trillion a year that we spend around the world in subsidies for the fossil fuel industry. $1 trillion. So how do we combat that and begin to recognize that we need to at least give a level playing field for renewable energy? And so the economics are very important. But I do think that the direct economics of investment and pricing externalities is one factor. But several of the speakers earlier have also pointed out just the raw cost of inaction. I want to share a quick story with you. The Somali piracy crisis. A lot of people don't recognize that when that started to grow in the 1990s and 2000s, and has subsequently cost hundreds of billions of dollars to the global economy, threatened the roughly 9 to 10% of global trade that passes through the Suez Canal. That has its roots in conservation. Originally, the pirates were protecting their fishing grounds, their historical fishing grounds that were being plundered by illegal fishing from the EU, Russia, China in the 1990s and the 2000s when the Somali state was unable to protect those waters. They were pulling out $300 million worth of fish a year. And these fishermen were no longer able to feed their families. And so what any of us would do is they fought to protect that resource. And that grew into what became this piracy crisis. And I actually have it here. I want to read it to you. There's a summary of a Department of Defense report that says, and I quote, "Simply spending a few $1 million on protecting fish habitats could have prevented violent extremist groups from metastasizing in East Africa, costing more lives and billions in treasure." Because, of course, much of the income from the piracy crisis has funded organizations like Al-Shabaab, Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, etc. So when we start to connect the dots between terrorism, these kinds of environmental degradation, imagine that, a few $1 million of fisheries conservation. It mimics what several speakers spoke about earlier, the cost of combating the destruction of nature that has led to zoonotic diseases like COVID-19, what cost tens of billions, whereas the cost of dealing with this after the facts cost tens of trillions. And so I think that's important to recognize too, is that inaction costs us a great deal of money. Action, as Eileen was talking about, investing in renewable energy can provide opportunity to create more income. And so there's two elements that we're talking about here. And two consequences for our economy in inaction and action.
I'm so grateful that you kind of talked about how those lines come together. I mean, I follow a lot on kind of global terrorism issues. If you get beneath a lot of the terrorism issues and the way it's playing, there are grievances out there, and a lot of those grievances are economic. There are various dimensions of that, of people having lost livelihoods and whatnot. So I love the fact that you made that. And just a quick 30 seconds, I'd love to hear what EchoStar's next big projects are. What do you need to succeed? What are the pieces and collaborations you think that would give you, greater surround sound echo effect? I should say echo effects of echo effect.
Well, at Earth Echo, what we're really looking at is how do we continue to build that global youth movement? How do we enhance that? How do we connect the dots between how young people drive social and cultural change in society? Because we can have a lot of effort and investment, which the environmental movement has in big conservation projects, changing laws, etc. But unless we have the cultural and social foundation to support that long term, it's not going to be sustainable. And that's where we've underinvested in the environmental movement. We've underinvested in education. We've underinvested in recognizing young people move the needle socially and culturally. And that's what we need to have so that we stop electing officials that deny basic fundamentals of science and the reality of climate change, and instead come together and solve these problems.
Well, Philippe Cousteau, founder of Earth Echo International, I saw you capture the imaginations and attention of a lot of people in the Web Summit in Lisbon a couple years back, and I think you did it again today. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Steve. It was a pleasure.
And joining me now is Congressman Rahul Grijalva, the chairman of the House Natural Resources Committee. Throughout his career in Congress, the chairman's been committed to defending wilderness areas and endangered species. In October, he unveiled his ocean-based Climate Solutions Act. Congressman, it's great to see you. I know we're on Zoom, normally we'd be in the same room. But look, I think one of the things we're probing today is what scaffolding, what structure and infrastructure conceptually do we need to put in place to look at conservation and environmentalism as a national security issue?
I think the premise, of anything we do in the next 2 years, next 4 years, with the Biden-Harris administration and Congress, has to look at it in a comprehensive way. That national security, with regards to conservation and with regard to climate change, are intricately tied together. And that juncture is important. Important for many reasons, economically, but in terms of just specifically national security, the threat that the ongoing climate change is posing to national security, whether that be on the facilities side of the question in terms of military bases, preparedness. Second of all, what it's doing on the economic and social side of it that puts national security pressure on the United States. All those things are, I think, woven together, and I hope that one of the first things that needs to happen is to ungag the Pentagon and military leadership in this country, so they can talk openly and freely about the effects of climate change, how conservation plays a role in assuring that national security continues to be not only a priority issue, but something that can be stabilized and constant. And if you don't do those other two, then national security is definitely threatened. And so hope that becomes the issue. And also, if we put science at the forefront of the decision making around climate, around the environment, around conservation, then that'll also be a huge plus in reaching some decisions. And I think our national security apparatus can be a huge voice in moving forward an agenda, a comprehensive agenda on climate change.
Congressman, when you talk about in the environment, conservation, the climate, I'm in a privileged position. I get to talk to a lot of Republican governors, Republican mayors, Republican members of Congress and senators. Sometimes they're private discussions, sometimes public. And I can find a bunch of them who believe that this is an important agenda. Former Energy Secretary Rick Perry, was saying, from Texas, that they've increased efficiency of cars, lowered carbon emissions. So why is it so difficult to get bipartisanship behind some of these? Because I hear them, I talk to them, but I can still see the very stark political divide in the nation right now, where if you're an environmentalist, you're seen as on one side of the aisle, but not on the Republican side of the aisle.
Well, and to your point, that one of the reasons is that the issue of climate change became ideological. When you basically downgraded science as a component to that discussion, which has been done, then of course the discussion became more and more ideological and political, and the divide is there, and there's no question about it. But there's also, and I mentioned earlier, that the voices of the national security aspect of this, their leadership, their voices, their analysis, and their studies that they've done take us in a big step toward having a conversation that isn't muted by people's already set upon ideological beliefs. Climate change is real. I don't think the denial debate is over. Now what we have to guard against is the avoidance aspect, where we don't deal with the issue. And I think that national security interests for this nation will drive us to the point that we have to talk about this issue.
I know that you have worked across the terrain on environmentalism, national parks, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, oceans. Many people look at the Biden administration as being, okay, the low-hanging fruit is let's just rejoin the Paris Climate Accords, box checked. What do you want to see the Biden administration do beyond rejoining the Paris Climate Accords?
Well, I think, let me use a couple of examples. The first one being that our nation's assets, their public lands and their waters, represent close to 30% of the solution or 30% of the problem in terms of climate change and global warming. And so beginning the transition to 30% of the solution, I think, is a very, very an important step that can be done by the administration. And beyond that, there's things that can be done there. I think also the bringing forth of the science and the information around national security as an issue, I think adds to that argument. But I really think that there's a lot that can be done to correct some of the damage that's been done, and there's a lot that needs to be codified into law. Those two can work in tandem and get many things done. But I think the administration, by elevating the discussion to where it should be, I think will bring action. And I'm hopeful that there's a assertive and robust effort to deal with climate change with regards to those public assets of land and water.
Congressman, as we close this up, I want to ask you a personal question. You know, I've read a lot about your statements and whatnot about conservation and environmentalism. You know, the other day you retweeted something from your committee which said climate change, drought, and wildfire are pushing our forests to their limit. And you went through what I know from reading this is that this is a really big personal issue for you, and something I don't often get the chance to is it's not a big personal issue for everyone. Why is it? What leap have you made that you'd like to share with our viewers today? As I think understanding why you're so personally committed, that human part of it may be useful in helping people understand why the policies are so important.
I believe that environment, conservation, are across all demographic lines in this country and on this planet, and we're so dependent on that. It's a question of survival for our species as well, and that's the urgency I put behind it. And so what we can do now in this time frame to protect those assets for future generations, to enhance the survival of our species, and to make this a more livable world for the future, I think we can do things now. And if we don't do things now, then we're leaving a worsening situation one generation after another. Right now, we have an opportunity for recovery. 5-10 years from now, everything we do will be triaging a problem that we can't deal with. And this is real, it's happening around us, and we as human beings have a great deal of control about how it goes in the future. So my feelings for it is personal, everything from justice issues to economic issues are all part of the environmental questions that's before us. And looming over at is climate change and what it is doing to us. And so I see that as an urgency that cuts across all demographics and all issues, and that we have to deal with it. I see it as an overriding and potentially for this country and the world, a bridge issue that can provide with some unity and Congress, some bipartisanship.
Well, Representative Raul Grijalva, chairman of the House Natural Resources Committee, author of the Ocean-Based Climate Solutions Act, and author of so many other pieces, I thank you for your work and for your time and candor today.
Thank you. Very kind of you to invite me. Appreciate it.
My final guest of the afternoon ventured to Gombe, Tanzania at the age of 26 and began her now famous study of chimpanzees in the wild. In addition to being the founder of her nonprofit, the Jane Goodall Institute, she's a UN messenger of peace and a Dame Commander of the British Empire. Big welcome to Dr. Jane Goodall. Dr. Goodall, we're sitting here, and I should say you've been tireless on this same message for as long as I've heard you, which is most of my life. I heard you last personally at the World Economic Forum in Davos when you were speaking to these issues. And I guess my question is to you, what are your best bits of advice to the nonprofits, to the governments, to the policymakers, to the people listening to this today on how to make a better connection between the global environment and our natural environment and national security?
Well, I think the most important thing that we have to realize is that we are part of the natural world, not separated from it. And it's our disrespect of the environment, our disrespect of animals that led to the pandemic that is causing so much economic chaos around the world today. And it's our disrespect of the environment that has led to climate change. I mean, it doesn't make sense, does it, to think that we can have unlimited economic development on a planet with finite natural resources, and on a planet where human populations and their livestock are growing. So right now, there are approximately 7.8 billion of us, and I cannot remember the number of our livestock on the planet. And already we're using up some of nature's natural resources faster than nature can replenish them. In 2050, it's estimated there will be closer to 10 billion of us. So if we carry on with business as usual, if we carry on exploiting the natural world in the way that we have been and still are doing, then that will lead to the extermination of all life on Earth, including our own, at least life as we know it. Some life will, of course, survive and recolonize, but as we are truly using up nature's resources in this ridiculous, I would almost say stupid way. And what makes it so absurd is that the biggest difference between us and our closest living relatives, the chimpanzees, who share 96.8% of our DNA with us, the biggest difference is the development of our intellect. So here we are, the most intellectual species to ever walk the planet, destroying our only home. And it's ridiculous. So that's our first message. We must learn to create a new relationship with the natural world, more respectful.
So with all respect for what I'm about to say, you have a couple of decades on me. And you've seen a lot. You've seen, when you went into the jungles, when you connected with chimpanzees, you also connected with a lot of other things. You know, the biodiversity you saw, I imagine, was more than I would if I were to go out there to ever see today. And I want people to hear about what you've seen get lost. You've lived longer than I have, but what have you seen get lost, and what alarm bells are going off for you right now?
Oh, well, I wouldn't give a whole list of what I've seen being lost because it would be too depressing. But, you know, I've been locked down here in the UK. I'm speaking from the house where I grew up as a child. And when I was a young child, I would wake up very early in the spring and open the window and hear the dawn chorus of the birds. So many birds, this beautiful dawn chorus. Now, 3 or 4 birds. We've lost most of our birds. That's because most of the insects have gone. Many of the insects have gone because of the pesticides and herbicides that people use because they want their gardens to look nice and neat, backyards, you call them. And so when I first got to Africa, you could drive along roads almost anywhere and there'd be animals. You'd see wild animals. And on the Serengeti, I had an opportunity to be there before going to Gombe, and I was allowed to walk out with one other young girl in the evenings. We met lions, we met rhinos. They were there, they were everywhere. And when I got to Gombe, this little tiny national park in Tanzania, it was part of the great forest equatorial belt that stretched right across to the West African coast. And by 1990, looking down from a small plane, Gombe was a tiny little island of forest surrounded by bare hills, more people living there than the land could support, too poor to buy food from elsewhere. Gone with the buffaloes, gone with the leopards, and many other animals as well. And, you know, traveling around the world as I did before the pandemic, I've stood in Greenland and seen the ice melting. I've met people who've had to leave their island homes because of the rising sea levels that make them uninhabitable. I've seen the results of the terrible, more frequent hurricanes and typhoons, the horrible after effects of the floods and the droughts, and of course the terrible wildfires. I've seen it with my own eyes.
You've been on a mission for a long time regarding chimpanzees, their natural habitat, preserving it. So one of the questions we've been discussing today is whether or not, as we think about investment and policy and the kind of, I hate to put it, crassly, but the dollar side of things, whether or not we need to, create dollar values for these things so that they are not just whims or something we're attracted to or want to think about on a good day, but that they have weight in a world that's become very commercialized. I'd just be interested. I know it's a crass level, but I want to get to what works. What have you found works when it comes to the economic side of preservation?
Okay, well, that's a very good question. It's not crass at all. And the communities that I've been working with, not just in Tanzania, Jengel Institute's now in 6 other African countries around chimpanzee habitat. And we are surrounded by people living in extremely dire situations, crippling poverty, lack of good health and education facilities, degradation of the land as communities grow and their livestock grow. And it struck me when I flew over this tiny little island of forest, surrounded by these bare hills in 1990, that if we don't help these people find ways of making a living without destroying the environment, we can't save chimpanzees, forests, or anything else. Because if you're really poor, you're going to destroy the last trees, fish the last fish, to either make money, to make food, because you have no alternative. If you're in an urban area and you're really poor, you've got to buy the cheapest junk food. You can't afford to say, did it harm the environment when it was made? And then coming back to Africa, ecotourism has been, in some ways, a boon because it brings in foreign exchange, which makes the central government happy. It provides lots of jobs with the hospitality industry and guides. And also, it's sort of helping the local people appreciate their wildlife. And we do need to put a value on it, crass though it may seem. I don't want to, but then I'm not in that situation of poverty. So, the sad thing about the pandemic is that there's been less money to pay the rangers, and a lot of the villagers have lost their jobs in the hospitality industry, and so poaching has gone up. So there's always problems to overcome. But yes, we do. For these poor people, we do need to put a monetary value or help them find a way of living without destroying the environment.
Dr. Goodall, I'm going to ask you an unfair question. That's part of my job. The unfair question I want to ask is, we have a new president and vice president coming into the United States, and I want Joe Biden and Kamala Harris to watch this segment. And I want to ask a tough question, because this is not a kumbaya situation. This is one where we hope people hear about the connection between natural security and national security and take action. What would be a couple of things that the Biden-Kamala Harris administration could do if you woke up and said, that is the right way forward? Or what could they do and say, that is absolutely the wrong way forward? I know you don't mince words, and you're an equal critic. So what would be the right steps for this administration? What would be the wrong ones?
Well, the right steps are to follow through on the commitment that Joe Biden has made to rejoin, I'm not sure that America left, but to enforce America's position in the Paris Agreement and to make climate change a really important part of the role that his administration plays. And that means protecting the natural world. It's going to be very tough because President Trump rolled back so many of the environmental protections that have been in place in America, some of them since Roosevelt. So he's got a tough job. But what he's saying, that climate change is going to be a priority, is good because, climate change, as it hits different parts of the United States, it is causing an enormous amount of hardship for people. But in addition to that, It's going to cost the administration huge amounts of money as the hurricanes get more frequent and worse, and the flooding and the wildfires. I mean, we've seen it happening, and it's not going to get better until some of these restrictions on protecting the environment are put back where they were before.
Well, Dr. Jane Goodall, founder of the Jane Goodall Institute, you've been a tireless advocate on these issues for years. And I'll say, I was in Davos, and I was actually traveling, I think, with then Vice President Biden when you were speaking at Davos that year. Leo DiCaprio was there and others. But, it's a spoiled crowd that goes to Davos. These are, people in their own mind that are masters of the universe, very wealthy, private planes. And I saw them walk out of your talk for the first time in their lives, probably introspective, saying maybe we needed to see things differently. I thought it would be impossible. So I know you have an impact, and I just want to thank you for all the things you've done on this topic.
Well, that's extremely nice of you to say that. And thank you very much. And I think the reason people listen is because they know I mean it, and I really try and walk the talk. And I should, as a last word, say, education is tremendously important. And I hope the Biden administration will push for environmental education in all the schools, because that is absolutely key to our future.
Well, Dr. Jane Goodall, thank you so much. Be well, be safe, and come back.
Thank you. I certainly promise I will.
Well, that brings us to the end of our program today. That was a real bucket list interview for me. A big thank you to the Natural Security Campaign and to all of you attendees for joining us for this set of fantastic discussions today. If you missed any of these conversations, we're going to have the video up from the entire event on our website shortly. I'm Steve Clemens. Thanks again to our hosts and our sponsors. Be well.